Every so often, during the past 3 centuries, an expedition would come to these shores to explore. But in 1927, something new was being attempted: exploration from the air. A motion picture cameraman accompanied the aviators, and he made a fascinating record of their expedition. They gathered at Halifax in July 1927. There were 6 pilots of the Royal Canadian Air Force among them, plus mechanics, riggers, wireless engineers, storekeepers, cooks, doctors. 22 military men, 22 civilians. Every trade you'd need for an expedition like this. They went north in the Stanley, a Canadian government icebreaker that was not the last word in icebreakers. In fact, 46 years later, one member of the expedition looked back on the old CGS Stanley with something less than affection.
The Stanley was a ship that had been built in 1895. That was the year I was born, as a matter of fact. And it looked to me, I was quite disappointed when I saw it because it looked extremely unseaworthy to me. It was very little freeboard. And after one stepped aboard, it was quite heavy. It felt like you were riding on a bag of cement and it would just sink from under you at any time.
Thomas A. Lawrence, Air Vice-Marshal, retired. He was in charge of air operations for the Hudson Strait expedition back then in 1927, when he was a squadron leader. The man at the right. With him is N.B. McLean of the Department of Marine and Fisheries, Ottawa, leader of the expedition. The Stanley, accompanied by a supply ship, sailed north through the Gulf and up the coast of Labrador. At Port Burwell, at the top of Ungava, they stopped and put men and supplies ashore to set up the first of 3 bases. And then they were on their way again.
When we moved out of Burwell to west the first time into the Straits, there wasn't a bit of ice in sight at all until we were out 3 or 4 hours, and there was a huge pan quite straight ahead of this vessel. When we got closer, we realized that there's quite a big polar bear on there all by himself.
Some of the men ran for their rifles, and before long, the bear was dead.
I always thought it was so tragic to see these beautiful animals killed. I never saw another bear while I was there in that time.
The purpose of the expedition was to make an aerial survey of Hudson Strait, to study ice conditions, and to determine just how long the annual navigation season might be for ocean-going freighters. How early in the summer was it safe for them to come? And how late could they leave in the autumn? It was important to know, for in 1927, a railway was being built north through Manitoba to Hudson Bay. Prairie grain would move out to Europe this way. But what about the ice in Hudson Strait? To answer this question, the expedition set up 3 bases: at Port Burwell, at Nottingham Island, and at Wakem Bay. It was a tremendous job getting it all ashore. The expedition would be away for 14 months, and the supply ship carried 2,500 tons of general cargo and 2,700 tons of coal. Buildings on the bases were constructed out of prefabricated sections. Each base had its dwellings, its storehouse, its radio shack, and of course hangars for the aircraft that would be flying the patrols, charting the ice in Hudson Strait.
We had 6 aircraft for operations, Fauer Universals. They were a high-wing monoplane, single engine, open cockpit. with a cabin for the crew and passengers to ride in. The aircraft was capable of about 110 miles an hour at cruising speeds, takeoff and landing speeds of about 46 to 50. The load, we had a load, a useful load that is, of people, fuel, emergency rations, and our cameras, etc., of about 1,700 pounds, which was quite adequate. All in all, it was a very successful airplane.
In November, at Wakem Bay, the temperature dropped below zero for the first time. By February, there were days when it was 30 below. And when the blizzards came, the snow would pack up hard against the hangars, imprisoning the aircraft inside. But once the hangar doors were cleared, there was still all that hard new snow on the landing strip, left behind by the blizzard. This too was a bit of a problem if you wanted to go flying. But when you finally did get the aircraft out, you didn't simply soar up into the sky right away. First, there was that small matter of warming it up.
The engines were drained of their oil after every flight, and the oil was put away and kept in a warm place, so that we had to reheat the engine by using blow torches. They had 2, sometimes 3, depending on the cold weather, with the heat going up through a stovepipe into an asbestos cover, which was built to the shape of the engine. These blow torches were kept on there, and very often the mechanic kept turning the prop around in order to keep the engine loosened up. It usually took a minimum of half an hour, and in very cold weather, about 45 minutes.
The Eskimos were often there to watch the takeoff, and they always liked to shake hands with the airmen. Besides this encouragement, the Eskimos also provided the airmen with items of clothing, like mukluks and mittens, that were far more practical than the Air Force issue from the south.
But we couldn't wear the parka because the hood itself restricted the movement of your head. Wearing it, you had to divert the airplane to see what was going on around you, and you'd upset the magnetic compass all over again. So we quit flying with parkas and went back to our own gear using a regular flyman helmet and goggles.
Once you were up in the air, the next question often was, precisely where am I? Navigation wasn't always easy.
We had 2 magnetic compasses in each aircraft, neither one of which agreed with the other, and they were always on the move because of the high content of magnetism in the ore in the country in that vicinity. We had Pioneer Earth Inductor Compass, which was one similar to that used by Lindbergh on his transatlantic flight. It was a good instrument, but we never got them to work in the Arctic. But you will have to realize that we were there to do a visual and photographic reconnaissance, so that we must always stay below any cloud or out of fog to be of any use. And we in the long run, had to fall back on straight navigation from point to point, map reading, in other words. Our maps were actually naval admiralty charts made by the British Navy in 1837. Our aircraft communications were limited in that we had a transmitter only. We could send messages from the air by key using a Morse code, or we could send it orally, the 2 methods. But we could not receive, and we never knew whether our messages were received or not until we got home and checked ourselves. I should mention at this point that our crew was made up of the pilot, a mechanic who was also a photographer. He took pictures with a handheld camera through the window of the aircraft, and an Eskimo whom we carried with us as a safety measure in the event of a forced landing, a chap who could live off the land and had some idea of traveling over open ice, which they were quite adept in.
Flying Eskimo guides. One of them helped save the lives of Flying Officer Lewis and Flight Sergeant Terry, who got lost during a patrol from Port Burwell. They were running out of fuel, so they landed on a huge ice floe. They abandoned their airplane, gathered their emergency supplies, and started to walk home. They trudged on day after day, spending the nights in igloos built by the Eskimo. Eventually, they ran out of food and were in danger of starvation. But the Eskimo managed to shoot a walrus, and they lived off the raw meat. Meanwhile, the other pilots were searching for them, but to no avail. Then, to everyone's surprise, they staggered back into their base at Port Burwell.
They had been away for 13 days in the coldest part of the winter. And that night, three of us pilots there, we had decided that we would do, weather permitting, we would do another search the next day. And if we didn't find them somewhere, it was to practically give them up, because it was just unbelievable that they could be gone 14 days under the conditions. But they came home and they had frostbites here in their face and some of their feet, but nothing serious. After 8 or 10 days, the doctor had them around again.
After the search operation, Lawrence decided to leave his aircraft at Burwell to replace the one that had been lost on the ice floe. He and his Eskimo guide would go back to Wakeham overland, more than 500 miles.
We procured a dog team and started out around the shores of Ungava Bay, down to Chimo, Leaf River, and through Payne Bay, then across country up to the sea ice about 40 miles east of Wakeham. This was a very interesting trip, 34 days in all. We stopped here and there at some of the Hudson Bay posts along the way and had a half-day rest or so and then carried on. I lived with the Eskimo in his snow igloo, which he built every day we stopped. We lived for the 34 days, with the exceptions of the odd meal at a base when we passed through, on bully beef and hardtack biscuits. At the finish of the trip, I think I was in better condition than the Eskimo, and I know that I myself, at the age of 32 or 33, was at the peak of my physical condition in my life. You have to have a group of people who are very compatible on an expedition like this. We had 16, 17 people at our base, a very compatible group really, but still at times the very living with people day in and day out and even playing bridge with them and other activities, you got fed up with the sight of them or yourself. And it was difficult to compete with, but I have to say that at no time was there any friction which was uncomfortable it was overcomable.
Good food, of course, builds morale. But up to the day before they left Halifax, they still hadn't found a cook for the base at Wakeham.
Our decisions were somewhat eased that day when Carr Harris, who was the pilot with me at Wakeham Bay, came along with an old gentleman along with him to say, here's your cook. He was a C-type himself. He was all of 70 years of age, a quite thin, wiry-looking person, and he was most anxious to get away north. And could he cook? Yes, he could cook, and he'd be happy, and it was fine, so we took him. We found out later that he was just about 2 jumps ahead of the mounted police for bootlegging, and that's why he wanted to get out of Halifax. But it turned out that he was an excellent cook indeed.
During his spare time that winter, Sergeant Kagi built a model of the Fauer Universal. It was a sturdy aircraft, one that came to command a lot of respect, and Squadron Leader Lawrence played a big part in its selection for the Hudson Strait expedition.
At the time we were requiring aircraft for this expedition, there were very few types available, suitable for that part of the world flying. Actually, there were some people who wanted to send us up there with a 2-seater Avro Viper on single one pontoon, a most unseaworthy aircraft, and only 2 passengers with literally no room for our spare gear. So we went back looking for another aircraft again, and the Fauer had been turned down at one point. But I went down to New York myself, at least I was sent down to New York and told that, well, you fly it, you look it over, and if this is the type of aircraft which you want, we'll buy it. Well, I went there and I flew one of their own type down. I liked it very much, and after Ottawa, I told them so, and they ordered the 6 of these aircraft, which were delivered actually ahead of date. It'd be interesting to note that they cost only $16,000 each. And it turned out that they were very good airplanes indeed.
Sergeant Andrew Kagi's model of the Fauer Universal, built at Wakem Bay in the winter of 1928. After the expedition, he took it back south with him, and it ended up at the National Aviation Museum in Ottawa. By June, spring was well underway, and at Wakem Bay that month, the average daily temperature was up to 39 degrees. The feeling of release that came with spring was wonderful, but the change of season brought its own problems for flying. Those smooth takeoffs and landings on skis would now no longer be possible. On June 17th, the last flight on skis took place. Now it was time to take the skis off and put the pontoons back on again. But between the hangar and the water, there was still a thick barrier of ice left over from winter. Chopping at it seemed to be a very tedious way to deal with it. So they decided to try dynamite. It so happened that the bootlegger cook was also a dynamite expert, and it was he who supervised the blasting. But not before he had thoroughly alarmed everyone by the way he prepared the dynamite, casually heating it up on the back of his stove.
We actually didn't do the number of hours flying of patrols that we had hoped to do because of many conditions which had to be dovetailed in order to let us get into the air and back again and get our aircraft out of the water. First of all, we had to compete with the weather itself, visibility, conditions and times of tides, conditions of the sea, whether it was too rough to operate a seaplane off. And the whole thing was the time suitable as far as daylight and darkness was concerned. We had a hard job, really, to get a time when you could get off and feel comfortable that you could do a real good patrol and get back in safely. And at least a patrol that had any value, because we had to fly below the overcast and have a reasonable degree of light to take photographs with. The recovery of a seaplane from the water was a hazardous and mean task. We had no water rudders on the aircraft, and we could control it directionally on the water only by bursts of engine and the air rudder control. Very often when we came in, we would have bad sea conditions, a rough sea rolling from any direction, with a tide on the ebb or flow, and perhaps not in keeping with the waves of the wind on top. And it was a question we had to maneuver quite a lot to get in the right position so that when we cut our engine, the aircraft would drift onto a piece of beach about 15 feet wide. And there the crew would be waiting in the water in their high rubber clothes to catch the aircraft. This was a pretty cold job because the water never got above 40 degrees in the middle of summer at all, and mostly down around 35. As well, the rest of the beach was very rocky, and if we had missed the aircraft catching it, it would have been a lost airplane for sure, because the floats would have been punctured, and that's it as far as the seaplane is concerned.
July the 1st, 1928, Dominion Day. Events organized by the Royal Canadian Air Force included one called Find Your Own Boots and Put Them On.
We had two Eskimo families in the employ of our expedition at each base. We looked after these people in rations and clothing during a period we were there, and then left them their surplus money, which was take-home pay, their credits with the Hudson Bay Company after we were gone. The women were expert needle people, and they made all our clothes. That's the Eskimo clothing that we wanted, our mucklucks and undersocks, duffel socks, parkas, and what have you. These mucklucks, when they were worn and got wet, when they were taken off at night, they became very hard, as a matter of fact, so hard that they would stand up like a pair of rubber boots. But the first time I personally experienced after wearing these things, the next morning I found the boots at my door, very soft, pliable, you could almost roll them. And I found out what had happened during the night, that the Eskimo woman had chewed these things to make them soft and pliable again. And this was common practice for them.
By August, the work of the expedition was done. It was time to go home. But instead of dismantling their aircraft and putting them on a ship the way they'd arrived, the pilots were going to fly home, all the way to Ottawa. Caches of fuel had been set up for them along the route south.
We rendezvoused at Cape Wostenholm, a place called Erie Cove, which has about the only sand beach I ever saw in the Arctic. We rendezvoused there successfully in the late afternoon with the plan of refueling there ourselves and then taking off at dawn the next morning for home. Come morning, we got started, and 3 of us were airborne. The other 2, one crashed on takeoff, and the other one had engine trouble and couldn't get off. What happened on the one that crashed, the pontoon fitting at the back broke off, and the propeller cut a great hole through the pontoon.
No one was hurt in the crash, but it was obvious that this aircraft could never fly home. Fortunately, there were 2 freighters in the vicinity, and they could provide transportation. For, as it turned out, all the aircraft would have to go home by ship.
When we beached the other 3 aircraft, we found that their fittings were just about ready to go, and it had possibility of another 1 or 2 landings somewhere, and we'd all be in the same boat. It was corroded from the salt water, corrosion from the salt water that caused this, really. So we packed up there and we dismantled the aircraft, and they were loaded onto the freighter, and that finished our expedition, which was a disappointing way to finish because we all wanted to fly home.
Squadron leader Lawrence and the other airmen might have been disappointed at the very end, but their expedition had been a success. During the year they had spent in the far north, they'd flown 227 patrols, and they'd taken more than 2,000 aerial photographs. And the information they gathered was an important contribution to the future of navigation in the waters of Hudson Strait.